Ever since I started woodworking, the one project I kept daydreaming about was making a chessboard. Well, when life gives you a pandemic, you make lemonade, or in my case, a chessboard. This project is made entirely of maple and walnut. I started with 3/4 inch thick by 4 inch wide pieces of each and cut them to length for what will become the squares. This was my most challenging build to date. I worked on it off and on for several months and I made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, a lot. But we'll point out the mistakes that have the most value from learning from.
I'm here with my 2 youngest shop buddies who will help me explain the process.
He headed over to the table saw and set the rip fence to 1 3/4 inches.
This is a little less than the 2 to 2.5 inches of a standard chessboard square. But we don't expect any grand masters to play on this thing.
I preferred to rip them a little narrow to make the most of the stock I was using. I wanted to reduce the amount the wood may move once glued up as much as I could, so I planned to resaw these 3/4 inch thick pieces in half for a thinner top. This was my first time doing real resawing on my bandsaw, besides some practice cuts on shorter pieces. It's not as easy as it would seem from watching YouTube videos. The blade can really have a mind of its own, which means it can wander. A wandering blade translates to different thicknesses once the two sides are separated. Plus, the bandsaw blades can leave a pretty rough cut that has to be cleaned up. In hindsight, I should have used my table saw for this. I would have saved myself a ton of time, but we'll get to that in a bit. To clean up the roughness left behind by the bandsaw blade, I put the strips on my vise and went after them with a hand plane. If I were to do this again, I'd make a jig to hold them in place that would sit on the table itself. Having the entire piece supported would have been a lot better. And if I'm being completely straight with you, I'd use the DeWalt thickness planer that I now have from my father-in-law. This was a bunch of work, but as you'll see, I'm a bit of a glutton for punishment.
He eventually gave up on that and prepped for the first glue up, figuring it would be easier to plane them all as one unit.
To make the joints as tight as possible, I clamped the adjacent pieces together and jointed them with my hand plane. This worked really well. For the glue up, I made a makeshift clamping setup that put squeeze pressure on it and held it down with cauls.
If you like what you're seeing here, consider subscribing to the channel. We got all kinds of fun woodworking projects we'd love to share with you.
Once dried, it was time to get back to the smoothing up the rough resawing marks. My dad set up a rudimentary planing station and got after it. Yay.
Dad dropped the ball and didn't get any footage of the actual hand planing process, but I can assure you there was a lot of it.
The lackluster resawing he did left him with some pretty significant thickness variations to smooth out.
It took a very long time, and I still ended up with a top that wasn't a consistent thickness.
It was more of a good enough situation.
I then pulled out my crosscut sled and set up a stop block to crosscut 1 3/4 inch strips for the checkerboard pattern.
Phew! Dodged a bullet there. I know we're more of a measure once, cut twice sort of operation around here, but that would have been pretty devastating to cut those strips way too skinny like that.
Thankfully, I noticed and reset my stop block and cut the strips at the right size. I'll save those devastating mistakes for later in the build. Now it's time to get that checkerboard effect by flipping every other one 180 degrees. A little glimpse of what's to come. How exciting!
Glue up number 2 with his same Jimmy rigged clamping system.
Remember when my dad was hand planing after the first glue up and he said the thickness wasn't perfect, but it was good enough? Well, now it's time to pay the piper. Pay the piper.
As soon as I flipped half of the pieces, the thickness variations were suddenly glaringly obvious again. More hand planing. So much more hand planing. About half of the squares had poor grain orientation for hand planing and ended up with lots of roughness. I took an 80 grit sandpaper to it in an effort to smooth it down for good. This actually worked pretty well. I thought I was good to go. Then I laid it down on the 1/2 inch MDF I planned to glue it on as a backer.
Notice anything a little off there?
Back to the hand plane. I won't bore you with the rest of this, but rest assured there was a tremendous amount of hand planing to get this thing to rest flat again. I ended up taking around 1/4 inch of thickness off of it by hand. In the end, it still wasn't perfect, but it was back to being good enough. I wanted this thing good and smooth once it was all said and done, so I wiped it down with a damp cloth to raise the grain.
Look at that beautiful coloring just waiting to come through.
One more pass with the sander at 220 grit and it's ready to go. I got ready to glue it to the 1/2 inch MDF backer.
Then he smothered it in glue.
I figured some 10-pound plates would help hold it flat, but I was wrong. I probably put too much glue on there and it ended up needing more pressure to really squeeze it tight. In a moment of absolute panic, I pulled out my cauls again and clamped it down, only to realize that the middle didn't have enough pressure. More panic ensued before I grabbed a 2x4 to use as another caul across the middle. Then I added some kettlebells and dumbbell plates for good measure. I had come way too far and done entirely too much hand planing to let a silly little glue up get the better of me. All that work really paid off, and I had a nice looking chessboard top ready to cut to size. I took it to the table saw and used my crosscut sled to clean it up and cut it to final dimensions.
With the checkerboard surface ready to go, it was time to make a frame for it. This will help hide the MDF backer.
I cut some walnut to length and ripped it down to size for a nice frame. To attach the frame to the board, I planned to use half lap joints. So I pulled out my dado stack to cut some rabbets. I cut rabbets around the entire perimeter of the board.
We thought it would look cool to have the board stick up from the frame a little bit.
So I eyeballed a good position and marked it, then rabbited all the frame pieces to match. To get perfect miters on the frame, I pulled out my miter sled. If you want to see how I made this sled, check out the video in the corner.
The most important part to get this frame perfect is measuring with the actual work pieces.
I still ended up sneaking up on the fit to get it just right. I'm basing the design of this chessboard off of one of Jay Bates' chessboard designs. His design is a box with the chessboard itself as the top, which slides open. In order for the top to slide open, I needed to cut rabbets into 2 slide pieces to make runners.
And some more cleanup with the hand plane and chisel.
One of my shop buddies came to help me with the glue up of the frame. I used this baster I got from the Dollar Tree to spread the glue.
I find it super satisfying to peel the dried glue off of it. You know, it's the little things in life, really. We tag teamed the glue up and clamped it in every way we possibly could. I can't keep it together. Every time I go to talk, it's like I can't stop. Okay, I'm ready.
Next up is the box frame. So I tip my blade to 45 degrees and cut the sides to length with miters on the ends. Notice that one piece a little wider than the others? Turns out that it's exactly 1/8 inch wider, which is the thickness of my table saw blade. That's important for later on. Now it's time to cut the dados for the top to slide into. A few passes through to sneak up on the dado thickness. I wanted this wide enough to slide nicely. Once I had it just right, I worked on making it nice and flush with the sides. The bottom of the box is 1/4 inch plywood, so I cut it to match the size of the top. Now the sides need dados for the bottom to fit into. Here's where that one piece being 1/8 inch wider than the others comes into play. This piece gets ripped with one piece attaching to the box and the other piece attaching to the top. That way it will look like a complete box when the top is slid closed.
It took a little finesse to get everything to fit just right.
Then I glued the front piece onto the top.
To glue the box up, he used the painter's tape trick.
Watching this now is super frustrating. I don't know how I mixed it up, but I glued the bottom into the dados I had cut for the top, and I didn't notice until it was too late. It was pretty demoralizing once I did realize it, and this shot is actually several weeks later. I walked away from it for a while, then came back and did a bunch of chisel work off camera to get the top to slide into the dados I had cut for the bottom. Once it was sliding nicely and I started to feel like it was salvageable, I started recording again. Here I'm trying to flush up the top with the sides. Turns out that the dado I had cut for the bottom was actually workable for the top after all.
After showing the box to my grandpa, we agreed it would be better to add some splines to the corners to make sure they hold up over time.
So I pulled out my spline jig and cut slots in the corners. Using a 1/8 inch drill bit, I measured for a strip to use for splines. I chose maple for some visual flair. Gluing them in, I had to make sure the splines were fully seated in the grooves.
This could be a pain.
I also added splines to the section that slides out. It's not at all functional, but it completes the uniform look.
It's time for the moment of truth. We chose shellac for the finish, and that choice was perfection.
However, my choice for camera position for the shot leaves a little something to be desired.
A few coats of shellac and it looked amazing.
Actually, it looked a little too amazing. I was hoping for a little less shine, so I hit it with some super fine steel wool to dull the shine a bit. It helped, but there's still a fair amount of shine there. So there we have it. After all the blood, sweat, tears, and hand planing I put into this project, and all the mistakes I made, I'm extremely happy with how it turned out.
It's far from perfect, but that just gives it a character and a handmade charm. And a handmade charm. Handmade charm. Handmade charm. In our next video, we'll show you how we made the chess pieces to make this a complete package.
Let us know how we did in the comments below and hit the like button if you liked this video. See you over there.
Boom! I'm crying. Okay, I think I'm all laughed out.